Hello and welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us on our presentation tonight. Before we start, Ed and I would just like to say that we are sharing our story tonight, not because we think we've done something great or we've done it right or we've even done our work with racial justice. We are sharing it because we know these conversations around racial justice and our history with slavery are hard conversations, but they need to be had. And we hope that our presentation will help you understand how you can have them, and they are so important to have. What happened? We found out about our parallel path with racial justice in a history presentation, not related at all to our lands. It was about the history of Groton. We found out that the Moores family had two members of their family, Abraham and his son Joseph, who owned slaves back in the 1700s. We, attending this as trustees for Groton Conservation Trust, knew we had a property, the Moore Schoolhouse property, and by our own website, we know we named it. We know that it was named for Joseph Moores, so that caused some concern for us, and so we took it back to the trustees to discuss this and to find out what we should do. Ed?
When we got this information, we realized that we didn't really know what we knew or didn't know. We had a document that was written by a member of the Groton Historical Society that said the schoolhouse was named after Major Joseph Moores. And it's a very small property. It's literally nothing but the site of the schoolhouse. There's nothing there other than that. But we were very concerned about what else we didn't know or knew or didn't know. And so we really dug in and tried to do as much homework as we could and really do thorough research rather than jumping to some conclusions about it. In this case, it was pretty complicated because in the 18th century, schools were set up in various districts where some particular landowner, homeowner would host a school on their property. And the school districts were known as Job Shattuck's district or Major Moore's district in this case. Major Moore's father, Abraham, was the first member of the family to move to Groton. He owned a slave, Zabina, and Major Joseph Moores himself owned Titus's son, Zabina's son, Titus. And we went down that path and tried to learn as much as we could. It turned out in 1754, when the state did a census, there were 14 slaves in Groton, which was, to some people, a surprising number. The schoolhouse itself, sort of on the school side of things, was built sometime in the late 1700s, and in 1805 was named the District Number 2 school. They officially, once the town was building school buildings, officially numbered all the districts. There were 12 at the time. Groton and Ayr were one town, and numbered them by various numbers, and each school building as it was built was known as the District Number 2 or District Number 5 or whatever, and that the schools themselves didn't bear any names, even though the district Number 2 was largely the same as Major Moore's district. District Number 2 didn't have any other name until 1873. What happened is we went backwards. And what we did is we went back and we really tried to look, okay, so Major Moores owned a slave named Titus. Really? Are we really sure about that? And we saw some history about advertisements for his lost slaves. And we went back to find, the June 13th, 1774 copy of the Boston Gazette, where Joseph Moores placed an advertisement for his mulatto manservant. And we were convinced, okay, this is really accurate. We have this right. Part of the research challenge in this case was that no one was ever referred to as a slave. They were always servants. And so it was a little less obvious who was who. The naming of the schoolhouse, we learned that it actually was not named after Major Joseph Moores. This is in 1873. It's almost 100 years later. And Dr. Samuel Green, who was the town's historian, very prominent citizen, initiated a process to rename all of these numbered schools in town after families or notable individuals or whomever. So we now have, for example, the Shattuck School, where the previous district number 5 school was, which was Job Shattuck's district early on. And we went through, found the town meeting minutes. What did they really say? What did they really vote on? And they voted that they would rename district number 2 in honor of the name of a large family by that name who resided in that section of town and whose descendants continue so to do. And in fact, it was a large family. And actually, at the time of this vote in 1873, the most prominent member, Major Moores was a very prominent member of the family, but in 1873, the most prominent member was Reverend John Farwell Moores, who was a Unitarian minister out in Greenfield. He was born in Groton. Out in Greenfield, he served as a chaplain in the Civil War. He was a very prominent abolitionist. He was Joseph's grandson. And so it was a very different mix of people in the family. And we realized that there was a lot to this, right? At the same time, not overshadowing the fact that we had this very significant problem of Abraham and Joseph both owning humans early on. Then we had to look at the history of the gift and said, well, okay, how did we get here? How did we get to this name? How did we get to this property? And this is actually the second property the trust ever acquired. It was donated in 1968. There was no mention of the schoolhouse. Again, it's nothing but the school. There's a foundation. There's nothing but the schoolhouse site. So it was sort of obvious what it was. There was an endowment created to maintain the site by a family who lived nearby. There was no name associated. The deed didn't name anyone. Obviously, you know, if we're thinking about renaming a property, we want to find the donors, we'd want to find the family, and there really weren't any that we could find, right? That it had really, sort of families moved away, and there weren't really any restrictions external restrictions, you might say, that we needed to keep in mind as we thought about the property, we thought about the name, and we thought about how to best handle the situation.
So with all this history and research that we did, that by we, I mean mostly Ed, did in combing through all these records, this was our timeline. We learn about this history in January. In February, we being the Conservation Trust, form a subcommittee that would do this research, would communicate the process to the community, and would ultimately make recommendations on what we should do about the Moore Schoolhouse property to the trust. In April, we come back to the trust with our findings. Come back with our findings to make 2 recommendations. One, that we educate members of the public about the history of Moore Schoolhouse. And 2, based on the fact that the town meeting vote to change it back from district number 2 to the Moore Schoolhouse, in fact, did encompass Joseph and Abraham, the 2 members of the Moores family who did own slaves. We recommended that we rename the property to the original name of the building, district number 2, which in fact, we found through history that property was called district number 2 longer than it was called Moore Schoolhouse. We also felt that since we had not named it, since the donors had not given to us with any stipulation about the name, we had the opportunity to make something right, considering that naming a property name is an honor to bestow, and we had the opportunity to bring some honor to that property. In May, after presenting all this, we let that go, and in May, at our May meeting, we voted. The trustees voted unanimously in favor of the education process that I talked about just a minute ago, and in a very close vote for our trust anyway, 8-6-1 against renaming the property. So what did we do with the education piece of it? Since May of 2021 and the vote, we've done a number of things. We were really since February, very transparent with all of our efforts about this information. We informed an advisory council, a group of 20 people, not trustees, that we talk with frequently about issues. We informed them, ran them through a presentation much like the one you're seeing here. We let our membership know through our 800-person email newsletter about this history. We created the whole process, including all of the links to the history citations that we found on our website. We worked with the Groton History Center to make sure our facts were accurate and have them part of this. We created informational signage at the schoolhouse site that had on there the entire story about the schoolhouse, the naming, the Morris family, and Titus and Zabina, the two enslaved people that we knew about that the Morris family in fact owned. We created an article in our town, in our town newspaper, for full transparency about how the trust handled that, talking about how we worked from January through May with the whole process, and about the education in the GCT site. And it ran in the paper, and the MLTA was actually very kind to pick it up for their newsletter as well. We have so far hosted one webinar with Dr. Carolyn Finney, someone that the MLTA has also hosted, on Black environmentalists and being Black in nature. We have plans to host another Black author and environmentalist come this fall. We created internally for ourselves a diversity toolkit for all trustees on our own Google Drive, with links to all the kinds of trainings, many of which is available through the MLTA, with programs and classes and speakers and books and education that we can take ourselves through. And in June or this summer, sometime this summer, we have local Boy Scout, as many of you I'm sure use Boy Scouts for their Eagle Scout projects, who will create a history marker at the site near this, and we will have him tell the full story on that history marker. But to reiterate, it's not something we feel like we're done with. It's a continuing education and learning process that we are undertaking, and we will continue to research everything we have found as well.
And we're trying very hard too to really thoroughly document that research. This is the kiosk that we placed on the property site. Susan really did a wonderful job working on this. Susan, you want to say anything more about this kiosk sign?
The kiosk is twofold. One side, we wanted to talk about the importance of the area and the native plantings, which the native plantings were used for medicinal reasons. So we have those all identified, but we also felt it very important on the other side to share this story. And so many of the neighbors were very happy to see this. We picture the schoolhouse, as you can see. We tell the story about how at that time, 1755, and the 14 slaves that we knew about. We also thought it was important to show the actual ad that Joseph Morse placed for $10 to get his slave Titus back, which he never did. We never learned any more history about Titus. And then we also felt it important to talk about Joseph Moore's grandson, Dr. John Farwell, who was a UU minister and an abolitionist, to kind of give a complete picture of that.
What we've tried to do is, as well as doing this work, really document what we've done very well, in part to make this available to everyone else, in part to make it available for review and critique. You know, we may not have everything right. I read literally hundreds of pages of town meeting minutes from the late 18th century, and I can't swear I got all those words right. So, you know, it's really important to get this material out there. We also recognized, going down this path, there's a whole space in the early history of the town. Groton was founded in 1655, where the early slaves were not Black. They were indigenous people who were also enslaved. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole part of that story that we haven't investigated and learned enough about yet. So we really, as Susan said, this is really an ongoing process, and we're looking forward to see how this informs our work at this site, at our other properties, and in terms of the educational activities that we do all together. Thanks.
Thank you. That kind of ends our part.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, first off, for choosing to attend our workshop tonight. I appreciate your time and attention. Hi, I'm Erik Boyer. I'm the Director of Stewardship at Wildlands Trust. Thank you also, Susan and Ed, for that great presentation. I will be talking tonight about interpretive signage that we developed in partnership with the Matakeesit tribe this past year. So the IHR, for context, the IHR trail is a 4-mile trail loop located along the Indian Head River that travels through both private and public land. These lands are owned and managed by the towns of Hanover, Pembroke, Hanson, Plymouth County, and Wildlands Trust. In 2017, the IHR Trail Coalition was formed to collaborate on an ambitious plan for improvements on the entire trail network. These improvements were funded with a successful application to the Massachusetts Department of Conservation Recreational Trails Grant Program. This funded amenity improvements, which included new parking areas, kiosks, signage, interpretive signs, and trail infrastructure improvements. So the first sign that we highlights the history of the Matakeesit tribe and other tribes in Massachusetts. The coalition developed signage for the entire complex that focused on the natural and industrial history, as well as the history of the indigenous peoples connected to these lands. The signage tells these stories to hikers as they make their way throughout the trail system. We reached out to several groups, and the Matakeesit tribe based in the area was immediately interested in collaborating. And just don't try to read this entire panel. These slides will be available to you after the presentation because I am going to move forward as I go. So this second sign highlights the agricultural, hunting, and fishing practices of the Matakeesit tribe. We formed an internal committee that consisted of Roxy Lay, our membership and communications manager, and myself. Roxy was responsible for the designing of these signs. And we first researched the tribal history of the immediate area in New England. And with this information, we developed a list of questions focused on general tribal history and the tribe's use of the land that we then directed to Dr. Larry Fisher, who is the Council Chief Sachem of the Matakeesit tribe. We retained Dr. Fisher to answer our questions to help form the content of these two signs. Our goal was to let Dr. Fisher tell the Matakeesit story, as it was not ours to tell. And a couple lessons learned from this project were the Matakeesit tribe should have been asked to be invited to be part of this project from the beginning, as they are the original stewards of the land. It was insensitive and potentially offensive to the tribes if they're asked to contribute at the end of the project or towards the end. Their participation cannot be an afterthought. We are incredibly grateful that Dr. Fisher was willing to work with us despite this. It was important to have funding to pay tribe representatives for their participation in this project. And the industrial and natural history of preserves gets told far more often, but the indigenous history needs to be the anchor of any property story. And it is key also to conduct background research before you approach potential project partners. Throughout this process, Wildlands Trust has learned to evaluate projects with a much broader framework of community engagement and awareness. We understand after learning from the Matakeesit during this project that the name of the trail system and other natural features in the area are problematic and need to be addressed. In future projects, Wildlands will complete due diligence and community engagement prior to beginning large projects to learn and include before we begin work. Our next case study, presented by our Special Projects Director, Rachel Calderara, shows the future framework Wildlands Trust will use to include diverse perspectives and voices. Our entire organization is grateful for these lessons learned during this process and how they will inform the future of our organization. And that's all I have. Rachel, I'm going to pass it off to you if you're ready.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Erik. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Rachel Calderara. I am the new Director of Special Projects here at Wildlands Trust. And as Claire had mentioned in the beginning, Wildlands Trust is a regional land trust, so we work throughout southeastern Massachusetts. Our office is located in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And over the last decade, we've been doing a ton of work with the city of Brockton, which is the only city in Plymouth County. And it is about an hour away from our headquarters in Plymouth. So the work that we've been doing in the city is going to be different from the work that we do in some of the more suburban or rural communities that we work in. Just a little bit of the history of the past 10 years of our work in this city. We first kind of entered this arena with the acquisition of the Brockton Audubon property in 2011. So we were able to acquire this property, and the map is down on the lower left-hand side there. 128 acres from the Brockton Audubon Society that was dissolving and looking to gift the land to another organization who would continue to protect it. So we took the land happily and we applied for a recreational trails grant. Like Erik had mentioned, we did the same grant for the IHRT project. We used that grant to install parking area, really revamp the trail system, build boardwalks, put in interpretive signage, a trailhead kiosk, and multiple points of entry, and the map itself, of course. So that was our kind of foothold in getting into this community and starting to really work with the people of Brockton. When we opened the Brockton Audubon Preserve in 2014 and started having community engagement events, we met some students from Brockton High School and their teachers, and we started a relationship with those students that ended up turning into an Envirothon club at the Brockton High School. Now, Brockton High School is a singular high school for the city of Brockton. It has about 4,200 students. So it's a really great central partnership where almost all of the students in the city attend this one school. We've been working with the school on Envirothon since 2015, so we're on our 8th year of coaching that program. And every spring, the students go to the statewide competition and compete in natural resource challenges, as well as throughout the year, they learn about a different environmental issue facing their community. So that's been a really great engagement tool as far as connecting with this really important partner, Brockton High School, and it's opened a lot of doors for us within this community. Based on our work at the Brockton Audubon Preserve, the city contracted us in 2016 to revitalize the city-owned Stone Farm Conservation Area. So similarly, we applied and received our recreational trails grant. We restored the boardwalks, we put in benches, signage, trailhead, kiosk. And if you can see at the bottom of the map, that light green area on the bottom right, that is the Stone Farm Conservation Area. So the two properties actually do connect, and through those two projects, we've created 5 miles of trails within the city limits that people can park and hike all day long. In 2019, to open that property, we threw the first ever, first and only so far, Brockton Nature Festival. Before the world shut down, we had about 200 people come out to this event, and we showcased the new trails that we had restored. We had games and activities and food, and we had dozens of community organizations tabling and showcasing their community work. So it was a really, really great way to connect with new people and bring everybody together kind of around this nature in the city concept. And finally, the other program that we have done in the city of Brockton is we're the state partner, or sorry, we're the nonprofit partner for the state program, Greening the Gateway Cities in Brockton. So as the nonprofit partner, we canvassed door to door and helped get the word out about these free trees that people could grow on their property. And we helped plant over 2,000 trees in the grayest areas of the city to increase canopy cover. So that's just a little bit of the work that we've done over the past 10 years. And what's been really important is the relationships that we've been building over this time with the high school, the different departments in the city, the community, other nonprofits in the community, and then even the people as we were going door to door for Greening the Gateway Cities and having those conversations with the residents. It's been a big learning process for sure. As an organization that, even though we're Southeastern Regional, like largely based in Plymouth, we're definitely an outsider coming in some ways to this community. It's our only city, like I said, in Plymouth County, and it's also considered a gateway city, which is a Massachusetts term for a post-industrial city. There's 90,000 residents, so it's by far our most populated area per square mile, and it's considered an environmental justice community as well. So there's a lot going on here. We have brought a lot of our own ideas, we've brought programs, we've brought actual land to explore, and we continuously work on ways to get better at kind of understanding this community and working to actually really serve what their needs are. And part of that means not just coming in and saying like, here's what we think you should do. Here's my idea, you should do this. So we're starting a new project that I'm about to tell you about, and we're getting started instead by taking a listening approach. This is the DW Field Park in Brockton. It is the gem of the city, some might say. It's a 700-acre park managed by the Parks and Recreation Department for the city. And recently, like 2 weeks ago, Wildlands Trust was awarded a 2-year planning grant for this city. So we are going to be working on improvements in ecological functioning, infrastructure, recreational opportunities, and outreach and education for this really beautiful park at the heart of the city over the next 2 years. It is called DW Field Park, and it was named for its creator, Daniel Waldo Field. So as we're starting to tell, put this project together and thinking about whose story do we tell, one of the obvious places to start would be the history. There's 2 significant documents that I have found so far that outline the park history. The first being the biography of D.W. Field, which was written in 1932. And the second being the application to make the park a National Historic Place, which was actually accepted in 2000. So it does have that designation. These 2 documents are compiled in this book that you can see on the left. And it's been a great learning experience for me to read this book. But as I have done so, I'm left with the questions of, how do we take some of this information and apply it to the current people of Brockton? To engage today's residents, and what methods can we use to tell those stories? So some of the things in the biography could be seen as problematic or even just confusing. It was written in the 30s. So even for me, like a lot of the language and the processes that were being talked about, they don't exist anymore. So I don't really know what's happening in some of the book. And then furthermore, at one point in the book, Daniel Waldo is having a cabin built for himself on his land because he becomes kind of an explorer. And it just says in the book that his colored man built him the cabin. So we don't know who that person is. We don't know if that person was paid. That's the only information we have. So things like that would make me pause and maybe not recommend this book to like one of our Brockton High School students who might be interested in learning about the park history. It could be a little problematic. So we're thinking about, how do we take this history? For all we know, Daniel Waldo Field was like a very great person who donated a ton of time and resources to the city and really wanted this park to be a place for all people. So we definitely want to find a way to tell that part of the story. We're approaching this project with a new framework. As I had mentioned before, getting started with a listening framework forward. So one of the things we're really conscious of is meeting people where they're at. By doing that, we can hopefully effectively communicate how conservation values align with personal values of people in the community. And a lot of what I'm doing right now is in the process of building partnerships and relationships with other community groups that will help broaden our reach and broaden our understanding. So this is a community group pictured here that we're in the process of creating a partnership with. And they can hopefully help us reach new audiences and reach like a more diverse community within the city. We're basing this on some research, of course. So the City Parks Alliance research shows a couple things of importance that I thought I'd share with you. One, engaging the community early and often can catalyze the community's sense of ownership and support sustainable park management. So if we can do that right, that's going to be huge in the long-term success of this project. And finally, placemaking, which is something you've probably heard of. I've actually first heard the term placemaking at an MLTC workshop a few years ago. So it's a collaborative process of creating public spaces that are meaningful to the community. If we can do this right, then placemaking can help strengthen local economies, can reduce crime, can drive civic engagement, and improve the health and well-being of users. So those are the goals that we're really working towards. So to summarize, if we are thinking about whose story do we tell, first of all, we have our own story of Wildlands Trust, how we've engaged the community in environmental stewardship over the years, and what we're planning on doing and what our goals are for the DW Field Park project, which, like I've said, are bringing the right partners together and really increasing community engagement. We have the stories of the people. So we want to create platforms and opportunities for people to tell their own stories about their park and their city. And these are the stories that are going to connect the people to the park and the people to each other as well. And then finally, the park history as well, the story of the founder, D.W. Field. Hopefully we can find information about the stories of people who helped actually build the park, the workers that were, boots on the ground doing the work underneath DW's watchful eye, who's a very boots on the ground guy himself. And then how do we bring that history to today's audience and make it meaningful for them? The bottom line is that important partnerships with the community groups and intentional outreach are hopefully going to allow us to hear from previously unheard voices and learn the untold stories, and that this placemaking process will shape our recommendations for the park improvements over the next 2 years. So that is it for me. I think we're going to move back to Claire, and then we're going to start taking questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. And to all of our speakers, that was really wonderful. Thank you for sharing. So before we get started on the Q&A panel, I just want to go over a couple logistics. We're going to be accepting questions through both the chat and through raised hands. So if you haven't ever raised your hand in Zoom before, you're going to be going down to that reactions tab, which is next to kind of a couple over from your share screen on your bottom bar. You're going to click on that and it will have an option to raise your hand. I'm going to be alternating between selecting questions out of the chat that are typed and going between raised hands. If I call your name, if your hand's raised, you're going to have the opportunity to ask your question and any follow-up questions. And we just ask that once your question has run through, you are lower your hand, which is using the same button once the question is finished. With that, we appreciate your respect during this Q&A session, and we're excited to get started. So go ahead and start adding those questions to the chat or raising your hands, and I will direct you to the appropriate person on the panel. Okay, awesome. So I just got the first question over chat, and this was not selected as a specific person, so please feel free to add if you would like this going to a specific person on the panel. Have you been approached with concerns about revisionist history and excluding some of the more problematic elements of the history of people and places? If so, how have you addressed these concerns?
Claire?
Awesome. Thanks, Susan.
I'll start out. We did hear among our trustees, we did have this conversation quite a bit among our trustees about how are you erasing history? I mean, a lot of the conversation that's happening across the country with this kind of discussion. Are you erasing history? How can you honor history without, if you're just precluding it? Which is one of the reasons our first initiative was to tell the whole story, create the whole story, fill in the gaps, give the context of everything that we know about the property, and then move from there. But yes, it did come up quite a bit in our own internal discussions. Once we made the decision, I don't recall, maybe Ed does, and I see that Chuck, is another trustee, is also on the group. Maybe they know. Once we made the decision, I don't think we had any conversations about that.
No, I don't think we did. Again, we weren't excluding people in the process so much as including them and illustrating some of the people that were unknown. In our case, we came down to this decision between these two names for the property, both of which were, as Susan said, perfectly legitimate names. They were genuine names of the property, right? And I would say, I don't like to speak for other people, but in terms of discussion among the trustees, a lot of the decision about naming was about how to best tell the story. What's the best path forward to tell the story, not about the story itself, because we knew that needed to be told.
Great. Do any other panelists want to add on to that, or I can move to the next question as well?
I think I just wanted to echo what Susan had said earlier in her presentation, that to have a property named after you or after somebody is an honor. And I think that we can change the names of things to honor people and still not be considered erasing them from history. We can still tell the history and honor the right people at the same time.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. So our next question is going to be directed for Rachel about DW Field Park. And this participant noted that DW Field Park is a great urban open space and has wonderful resources for Brockton. He remembered that there's a lot of water bodies, which there are, and he's seen some people fishing. And asked if people are fishing in the park, and if they're catching fish in the park, are those fish safe to eat? And kind of questioning if we're going to be doing any programming related to that. So I know we're brand new to this process, so I'll let Rachel speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting question, Russ. There are a lot of people fishing. It's a great recreational activity that is popular at the park. We are starting to work with the DW Park Association, which is the nonprofit friends group for the park. And they're planning a fishing derby in, I think, date TBD. And one of their goals for the fishing derby is going to be educating the public about fishing licenses. I think they're looking to host it on the Amnesty Day in June so that you don't actually have to have the license, but then folks from Mass Wildlife would be there, like educating people on licensure. As far as eating it, there is water pollution issues, and that is a question I don't have a definite answer for, but the ponds are very shallow. They're all man-made. One of them used to be open for swimming back in the 60s and was shut down in the 70s because of pollution issues. So I'm thinking that the majority of the recreational activity is catch and release there, but I am not 100% positive.
And Claire, if I can just jump in for a second. Early on, I saw that Russ posted a note about the traditional municipal plants on the Moore Schoolhouse site. I actually just took a moment and emailed Russ a list, and I noticed that we actually don't have that on our website on the page for the Moore Schoolhouse property. So I'll make sure we add that and people can go there and look at that list of plants.
Wonderful, Ed. Thank you. And at the end of this, we will be providing presentations and additional resources to MLTC for them to post as resources for everyone post-conference. So if we have any interest in documents like that, we can hopefully include them so that they're available for everyone. Great. I don't have any other questions in the chat right now. I did, oh, and there we go. We got a hand. Perfect timing. And Danielle, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hi, thanks for a wonderful presentation to everyone. For Ed and Susan, you've talked about the discussion amongst the trustees and the decision about the renaming. Could you talk a little bit more? Maybe I missed it in your presentation. There's a lot of information about what was the reaction in the Groton community. And I'm just curious, in these decisive times, you know, did it become decisive in the divisive, I should say, in the community? And, you know, I see some of these issues, and the next thing you know, there's just a flurry of letters to the editor and controversy. And I'm wondering if you encountered any of that and how did you deal with it?
Thanks, Daniel. That's a great question. The one thing we wanted to do from the very start, from the February when we were planning this, was to be very transparent about what we were facing and what we wanted to do with it, and communicate that with our constituents, with the town, to let them know that this is what we found, this is how we're going to address it, this is where we're going with it. Of course, we heard from people along the whole cancel culture and all the divisive things that you're thinking about, but those were those are mainly on the fringes. I think most people were receptive and appreciative that we were taking the time to dig deep into the history, to kind of understand what it meant, to give lots of thought to it in a very deliberative way. So it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction, it wasn't an emotional reaction. We had a question from someone earlier about did we think about polling our constituents or the town of Groton to see what they had to say about what we should do. And we also very deliberately made a made a motion that we would be the ones to decide what we would do with this property. We would certainly be transparent and tell everybody what we're going through, but we were not going to let the town or any townspeople, without the benefit of having the history and the research that we had, make this decision for us. We wanted to make the decision for the property with everything we knew. So I think to answer your question, we did not hear a lot of grumbling or divisiveness around this. And I think in part, mostly because of the very steady way that we let the information come out, and we're transparent about what we were going through, and just we're open at every step of the way for people's questions. Ed or even Chuck?
I think that's all right, and we really try to do the best we can. We also have to acknowledge that at the end of the day, we did not change the name, right? And so, to many people in town, the whole process was probably invisible, right? Had we changed the name, the outcome may have been very different, would have had a very different kind of situation. But, we really didn't, Susan and the rest of our communications team did a really good job of getting the word out, engaging people, and getting that conversation going.
Could I just follow up? So now I really feel like I missed something. So you, in the end, you did not change the name to the District 2 schoolhouse?
No,
You didn't go
Daniel,
back?
it was one of the closest votes that many of us remember in our trust 50+ year history. It was of our 15 member trustees, it was an 8-6-1 vote, 8 against, 6 for changing, and 1 abstention. So we did not change the name to District 2. We kept the name. I also want to underscore that we all unanimously voted to do the education process and complete the information and be fully disclosing the history as we know it. So that was 100% vote. But no, we voted not to change the name.
Yeah, and I think, not to pat ourselves on the back, but these conversations are difficult, and organizations need to be able to have them in a way where there's disagreement about how to move forward, come to a consensus, and then, take action from that point of view. I'm very happy that we were able to do that. That's an important part of the whole process.
That's great. Thank you. Because I saw 861, but I just assumed that it was close and that you changed it. And I couldn't make those calculations, 861, and figure out.
I'm sorry. I should have been more clear about that. Yes. 8 voted against, 6 voted to change, and 1 abstained.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thanks for all your effort on that project.
Friendly face.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Appreciate the questions. Quickly going to pull one from the chat. Erik replied to this, but I think it's definitely an important thing to address. John said, Wildlands, did I see a reference to Indian Hill Trail? If so, has there been any discussion of changing the name to better reflect the Indigenous population? That is actually called Indian Head Trail, and I'll let Erik talk on that.
Sure. So that's a good question. So it's the Indian Head River Trail is what it's historically been called. And I would say that we've talked about it internally amongst Wildlands Trust staff, but it's a conversation we want to have with our project partners, and also include the Matakeesit tribe within that conversation as well. So that's a conversation yet to still to come with a larger group of partners.
Great, thanks, Erik. Charles, you're welcome to ask your question. I see your hand is up.
Yeah, this is Chuck. 2 things. One, the question about the community response to the trust dealing with this. I think the community response that I heard was mostly all positive. People were very pleased to learn more about our town's history. And clearly part of the town history that many of us have lived here for a long time had not heard anything about. So I think there was a big positive reaction. And then just on the name change itself, I think the fact that when this last naming happened was soon after the Civil War, and the most prominent member of the Moores family at the time was this active abolitionist, the minister from Greenfield, led many trustees to conclude that the name wasn't as tainted as we first thought it was. So I think that was part of the decision-making process. And then the second thing I wanted to ask was about the Indian Head River Trail. You had mentioned in passing that it was, quote, problematic. I'm curious about, one, what does the tribe think of it? And two, do you have any specific plans as to how to work that issue going forward?
Yeah. Yes, Charles, good question. Our first conversation with Dr. Fisher, he had directly mentioned the name and that it was offensive. So that we received that feedback directly. And I think in terms of a plan moving forward, I think the first step is talking with the members of our different partners, and then also including the Matakeesit in that conversation. Just to start the conversation is really the first step. Past that, it's what depend on where the conversation goes, honestly. But that's my thought, I guess, on that.
So just one quick comment. I was reminded of this issue again. The latest issue of the Sierra Club magazine has an article about the number of places that have the word squaw in them and what the Sierra Club is doing to try to deal with that issue.
Oh, I'll check that out. Thank you for that. That's helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Chuck. Oh, Rachel, sorry, were you going to say something? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Great. Okay, so we had a question from Margaret. She said, can you tell a bit more about the process of telling Indigenous history in the signage in your collaborations with the Matakeesit tribe, especially how to let the Matakeesit tribe tell their own history without burdening them or expecting a lot of their time and compensating them properly?
Good question, Margaret. So in our initial conversations with Dr. Fisher, we sort of discussed what topics would make sense to sort of try to cover with the signage. And then we went back and did some research on those topics and basically came up with a list of questions that wasn't too long, but they were pretty general so that he could provide us his sort of thoughts without us sort of trying to narrow him down in any one direction. And then he gave us a long sort of packet of information that he put together, and that we used that to sort of formulate the shell, a draft of the signage, and then we worked with him to sort of trim that down. We were able to pay Dr. Fisher for his time with the recreational trails grant that we had through the state. But if we hadn't had that funding, we would have had to try to come up with it another way. But we tried to keep the process as simple as possible for him, because he is somebody who is pulled a lot of different directions, and is a very incredibly dynamic person that is involved in a lot of things. So we were grateful to have his attention and time helping us with this. Hope that answered your question.
Wonderful. Thanks, Eric and Margaret. We actually do not have any other questions in the chat. So if anybody wants to ask a question, go ahead and throw your hand up and I will select you. Okay, Daniel, I see your hands up again.
Yes, I just like to go back to the Brockton project on the DW Field Park. I'm just curious, because we have time, could someone tell us more about DW Field, and was he an industrialist, and how did he make his fortune, it seems, and I'm curious about that.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, for anybody on this call, and you know, I actually do recommend that book. It is very informative, but you just have to remember that it was written in 1930. Take it with a grain of salt. Daniel Waldo Field was born into a farming family. He was very entrepreneurial and became one of the biggest shoe manufacturers in Brockton in his 20s. And that's how he made his fortune. The Brockton, if you don't know, was the shoe capital of the world at one point. Most of the shoes made for Union soldiers in the Civil War were made in Brockton. So he made his fortune that way. And then he just had a very interesting life. He ended up traveling to California every winter, being really interested in the land. He at one point had a nature preserve where he was ordering animals from all over the world. He was a successful, he raised dairy cows, like the best in the world. He then went back to school for biology at MIT, and then also went back to school for business after he'd already been successful in business. Him and his wife had no children, and he decided he'd always had this vision of building a city park. He was very well traveled, so he'd seen lots of city parks. And he started buying property from private landowners and putting that park together with his own money, and consider that his legacy to the city.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Rachel and Daniel. I just saw in the chat related to our last question, Russ said that regarding name changes, he recently became aware of a trend to rename the plant formerly known as Indian pipe, the ghost pipe. I thought it was a really interesting comment. Thanks for sharing that, Russ. Great. And Eric, Eric, if you want to comment on that, go for it.
Russ's comment, there is a precedent for that. With the recently, the gypsy moth was renamed the spongy moth. So there definitely is momentum. We're seeing that starting to happen. So that's something I just learned the other day.
Wonderful, thank you. We had another question regarding, I think, Rachel's presentation. Diane said, you mentioned environmental justice community. Could you give us a little more information on that?
Yeah, definitely. Just as a little bit of context, we did have a former staff member at Wildlands Trust, actually ironically initiated both of these projects, did a ton of work in the city of Brockton working on this state partnerships and RTP grants, and also started the IHRT project that Eric talked about. So I know that he had told me that there were areas of the city, or like 90%, something like that, of the city was considered environmental justice. And I've been trying to track down exactly how that's classified and how he got that information. But the biggest environmental issues in the city that would be kind of contributing to that are lack of natural resources, and they have a big water supply issue, where all the 5% of their water is coming from outside of the city limits, sometimes up to 20-30 miles away. So those kinds of things, and then ground pollution as well from the shoe industry. It's really unsafe to grow like food in a lot of areas. So there's a lot of community gardens with raised beds, for example, where you have to like bring in soil just because of the ground contamination there. So I know that just off the top of my head that those are some of the issues they're facing.
Moving out of my role a little bit here, but if I can add on to Rachel's comment, within the US Census data classification for an environmental justice community, there's 3 classification measures that contribute to a population being called environmental justice community. It's dependent on English speaking percentage of that group of population, the relation to the poverty level, and whether they are classified as a diverse community with BIPOC citizenship over 50%. So there's really good information on that on the EPA's website, and a new mass mapper tool that came out this year where you can actually go through the state and see what communities are classified as environmental justice.
Oh yeah, thanks for that. And Brockton would definitely fit into this category. It's a big immigrant community. There's a lot of different languages spoken. It's a really rich place. I definitely encourage anybody to visit the park and the community. It's an awesome place to visit. I think just last year on the census from 2020 or 2021, the percentage of people identifying as Black past 50%.
Awesome, thank you. And Amy just had a comment that she had a session with DCR earlier today, and there's information on the EJ designation on their website. So it's a great additional resource as well.
Thanks, Amy. I just saw that.
Great, and thank you for that link, Jess. Just got another comment from Russ, and he says, if you heard correctly, the Groton Conservation Trust found out about the slave history of the Moore Schoolhouse site by accident. It seems to him that Land Trust and others did more proactive research. They may also find more untold stories about more of their land holdings. Does anyone on the panel want to speak to that?
I would just say that it made us realize, in the case of this property, it was the Moore Schoolhouse site. And there wasn't, like, no one chose that name. It was the Moore Schoolhouse site. What it was, that's what it was. But we have other properties that are named after other families in town or other situations, and really did sort of stimulate a lot of research, a lot of education that, as Susan said, is still ongoing.
And I would encourage anyone to use your town history center to go back into some of these areas. We live in Massachusetts, so all our lands tell a story. All our lands have people that we should be naming on those properties, not us. So there's great things to be found, and yeah, a proactive approach for us is absolutely the right prescription.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Great question, Russ. Appreciate that. Okay, well, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or throw it in the chat, questions or comments. We have about 10 minutes left in our question and answer session. So if anyone has anything, that would be a great time.
Claire, that comment just reminded me that, this isn't always a controversial issue. And one of our properties we acquired through a Trust for Public Land project. We have 144 acres of hayfield and land, which based on our research and looking into it, in fact, Chuck McNierney did most of the work. We named the general field because that was the name of the property in the 17th century. The area was known because it was used as a common field area, and it was known as the general field, and opened up again a whole other story about our history that we didn't know about. And you just never know what you're going to find, so it's always worth looking.
Great point, Ed. Thanks so much for adding that. Awesome. Well, does anyone else have any questions? I'm happy to kind of get us wrapped up as well. Just give everybody a little more space to think and add anything they'd like. Oh, and another great link from Russ thrown in the chat there. Underreported story about the history of Black people living around Walden Pond from the NRDC. Thanks, Russ. Okay. Any other questions or comments from our panelists?
Well, thank you, everybody. This has been really educational for all of us, and it's been a pleasure to be a part of it. So thank you all for asking questions and being here.
Thank you as well to everyone. Have a good night, and thanks again for giving us your attention and time over this last hour.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, and don't be afraid of the conversations.